welcome, good evening, and a very warm welcome to tonight's event, The Evolving City. I'm Emma Clegg from Transition Bath, and we're co-hosting this evening in partnership with the Brilsey. A little bit of background about Transition Bath. We're a local charity that promotes a low-carbon, sustainable future for our city. We're especially interested in how Bath will grow and change in the future, how it deals with climate change and housing pressures, and how it can protect its natural beauty and heritage, which is where tonight's event comes in. Tonight we're going to hear from Bob Allies. Is that the right pronunciation? Allies. I was practicing that earlier and I had it perfectly and it came out wrong. He was appointed last October as Bath's first architect in residence. This is a new role focused on guiding design excellence in our World Heritage City. Bob is an architect, a professor at the University of Bath, and co-founder of Allies and Morrison, whose work has helped shape how cities grow and adapt. Tonight he'll talk about his role in Bath, how towns and cities evolve, and how we face big challenges in the face of the housing crisis and the climate emergency. Bob will speak for about an hour, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Please join me in giving a warm welcome for Bob Allies.
Brilliant, thank you. Actually, there's some last ones here. Are these, hello? Are these ones possible? Or are they for me to see me? Okay, in the picture, okay. Right, okay, so we can begin properly. So thank you very much. Thank you Transition Bath and Brilsey for inviting me to give a talk here tonight. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about my practice, Allies and Morrison, and the work it's been doing. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about Bath and the role that I have here, and I'm also going to try to talk a little bit about my sort of take on some of the issues surrounding the way in which cities evolve, both in the future and as they have evolved in the past. I'm going to try and aim at about an hour, and certainly I'd like to leave time so that not only for questions, but actually I'd be very interested to hear from all of you about the sorts of issues that you feel I should be addressing in Bath. I mean, I've spent about 9 months so far in the city, working in the city, and I mean, I hope I've done a few useful things, but one thing I've certainly done is to talk to a lot of people, and in a way that, conversation is a really important part of the job, I think. So it's great to have that opportunity to do that again tonight. I gave my talk, I'll move, let's get the first image. I gave my talk this title, The Evolving City, partly in a way as a sort of deliberate nod towards Transition Bath, I mean, because of its title. And the idea or the sort of recognition that cities, which Transition Bath implies, and certainly I believe, that cities have to evolve and they have to change if they are to survive. I mean, it's very difficult for a city just to remain as it is. It has to keep moving on and gradually making the sort of transition which has now become perhaps an even greater priority in a period of a climate emergency. And certainly for my practice, we trained as architects, we started as an architectural practice, but much of our work, certainly over the last 20 years, has been involved with thinking about towns and cities at a bigger scale and thinking about how they can change and evolve in response, not initially to the climate emergency, but just to changes in needs and changes in aspirations. The image on the screen is of King's Cross in London. So on the left-hand side, the site as we inherited it, almost exactly 25 years ago. King's Cross has taken, that's the time period really from day one to the finishing of the project. I mean, it's probably going to be finished next year, but I mean, pretty much that time span. And then a photo on the right of Granary Square as it exists today. And one more picture, just as a kind of contrast. On the left-hand side, you can see the site again as we started working on it. So that's King's Cross Station on the left, St Pancras on the right, and that's the new Eurostar terminal, the roof of it being built on the bottom right. And you can see the complete chaos that existed between the two buildings at the time. And that wasn't just the product of the construction of the station. That was, in a way, a characteristic of how that area existed at the time. And then the photo on the right is now standing or sitting in Pancras Square, and you can see a few landmarks there, therefore kind of repositioned into the new city. So you can see obviously the tower of St Pancras on the right and on the left. You can see the Great Northern Hotel here, and here that's the same gable there, and then just in here you can see the German gym, which is just sort of sitting there in the project. So part of the project was in a way, while adding new things, very much to give places for some of the historic buildings that we were able to save. And then just to give you a slightly wider picture, that's, we were looking at this area here between the two stations. They're kind of competing with each other, of course, to arrive in the centre of London. They almost crash into each other. And yet they also conform to their respective urban grids. So this is the Islington grid here, extending here, and this is the Camden grid extending there. So they're sort of, they're both competing, but they're also participating in the city. And then the site extends to the north, and it really follows more or less that alignment of defined by the roads and the railways and by the line of the new Eurostar track which runs across here. Interestingly, and just in passing, St Pancras arrives on a viaduct, so it's above ground all the way back. King's Cross, the trains dip very, very rapidly and go under a tunnel, through a tunnel here, and under the canal, and then extend out of the city in that direction. And of course the canal crossing through the site here. The great advantage of the site, and I think it's difficult to talk about the project in a way because everybody would like it to be a kind of exemplar that one could apply in other places, and maybe a little bit of it can be, but it's such an unusually gifted site because of its central location in London, and also because of this extraordinary legacy of 19th century buildings which we inherited. Well, many of them, but perhaps the most significant being the granary building here and the transit sheds which lay out behind them. So we kept as many of the historic buildings as we could, more than just the listed structures, through a kind of, a realization which, is sort of a blindingly obvious realization that these were assets and these would really make a difference to the character of the place as the scheme evolved around them. The granary is a really extraordinary building. You can see it here, and this is a cubit watercolour from the middle of the 19th century. And what's significant is that there was a canal basin in front of it between the canal and the building. And even more remarkable, in fact, was the fact that from that canal basin, you can see canal boats disappearing into tunnels underneath the two buildings on either side. And then when you go into the transit sheds on the back, you can just about make out, I think that here you're looking at canal boats, which are now nestling side by side with railway trains. So the goods are being transferred directly from canal to railway. It was the first intermodal transport building to be built in the world. So it's a really important building. And when you know that the canal, that's where the canal basin was, of course, you also perhaps give some meaning to why we put all the fountains there. Because the fountains, as well as, so they provide a memory of where the canal basin was, which is important to us, but they are also incredibly important in terms of the role of King's Cross as a kind of a social condenser. In another way, it's because the fountains bring families and young children in that the place has been so happily assimilated into its context, which includes very impoverished neighbourhoods really on either side. So the kind of social aspect of the fountains has been really key. The plan of King's Cross works really through a succession of a series of spaces from a square outside the station here, a second square, Pancras Square here, and a boulevard connecting to the canal. Granary Square at the heart of the project here, and then two Cubic Square and Cubic Park leading up to the north. And then a succession of more kind of informal spaces along the edge of the canal here, and occasionally a little kind of formal square dropped into the fabric of the buildings on either side. So just to kind of walk you through that, I mean, some of you may have been, but I'm sure lots of you won't have been. So this is walking from between the stations, setting off into the project with the German gym on the left. I've already shown you a picture of Pancras Square, so next is Granary Square. I mean, interesting, I think, because it's almost a kind of as-found space. You know, we haven't really shaped it very much. We have made some little insertions, a little group of trees here and a pub on the end here, which actually are very important in defining the space, actually in that dimension. And then, of course, there's steps leading down to the canal, to the towpath. And one of the great benefits of building here actually has been in the end of the towpath, which was really a no-go zone. It was a dangerous place to be at any time of day, is now absolutely integrated into London's public realm. Then this is moving further north to the Cubic Square outside the coal drops, and then looking back the other direction from the square into the Cubic Gardens to the north. And then these kind of more peripheral landscapes sitting on top of what was a road viaduct, and then the space around the canal with the locks. And you're standing next here to the gas holders. There was this extraordinary group of 3 gas holders that joined together, called the triplets, and they were dismantled to build the railway. They were then, all the parts were shipped up to Yorkshire. They were then restored and brought back, and then housing has been put inside them, and then they've been put on the other side of the canal to the side they were on when they were first built. And then this is the last little square, little garden square. And then there are some perfectly straightforward streets as well, which is important. So I'll say more or less, we're trying to make a normal piece of city. So this is the main east-west street. Even more important, I think, is that in the other direction, it leads out directly and joins on to one of the existing streets. So there's just a normal traffic light and cars can come and go. So it's completely integrated. And that ambition was very strongly stated in the documents and things we produced. And we did it, and then it's funny now because it's a kind of weird historical anomaly now, showing an A to Z map of London, because they don't exist. And young people say, well, what do you mean? What is it? But you know, for Londoners, it was absolutely the way we understood our city up until about 15 years ago. And so what we did was to draw the project as part of the A to Z map, so that, you know, everybody could understand it absolutely in the terms they understood the rest of the city. And that sense in which how important it is, really, the new developments in cities don't stand apart from the city. They absolutely participate in it and try and become part of it, I think, is key to ensuring that they are drawn into both the physical fabric and the social fabric of their surroundings. Now that issue of making those connections is something which I think is one of the areas where I think in Bath there's a sense of dissatisfaction about what's been achieved. This you'll recognise this picture. This is Bath Western Riverside. I actually think it's quite a good project, I should say, and this is one of the nicest of the buildings. I think it sets a kind of appropriate tone in terms of its architectural ambitions. But of course the weakness is in a space like this where you arrive at it. Now that will, I hope, in time be resolved as other buildings come forward, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to achieve that. And in a way, I look at this and think particularly that those 2 signs on either side saying Bath Riverside are absolutely epitomise to me what's wrong about the project. I mean, you know, in cities, that should never happen. You should never have signs separating one part of the city from another. It should be seamless. And if I was a planner, I'd ban it. I wouldn't let you put up signs that do this sort of thing. So that question of not that question, but moving on a little bit then to talk about the implications of projects like King's Cross or how they came about. King's Cross was, I said it began in around 2000. In 2004, it became adopted as one of the mayor's opportunity areas. And these were areas that Ken Livingstone defined, with help from others, which were looking at places where London could grow, where more housing could be built. And it was a recognition of the prospect then that the city had of an extraordinary growth in its population and the need to try and do something about that. And it was really was a critical issue, because when you looked at the history of London and how it had evolved over time, how it had grown and gradually expanded, you can see how near it's getting in 2020 to its boundaries. But to me, almost more interesting in this sequence is actually what happens in what you see between 1900 and 1945, when there was extraordinary growth in the land area, almost 5 times the land area. And I suspect you could go back to 1939 and it would be the same figure. So in a very short period of time, the city area, the land take of urbanization being absolutely extraordinary. And of course, the reason for that was really, it all comes back to the Garden City movement. The Garden City movement in this country is generally seen as a good thing, and governments like to talk about building new garden cities. But in my mind, the Garden City movement was a bad thing, just to be provocative. And one reason for that is that one thing the Garden City, the architects of the Garden City and the people behind it believed very strongly is that we should move away from the sorts of densities of housing, terrace housing that were shown on the top there, which are, you probably can't read it from there, but that's 41 houses per acre in this terrace streets. And we should move towards a scheme where you have 11 houses per acre. So you were a quarter of the density previously being built in cities in Britain was what they were proposing. And they were so successful. I mean, it was an extraordinary movement that grew not only nationally, but internationally. They had annual conferences which grew every year from 100 to 200. There were 1,000 and 1,500 people coming to conferences in the 1920s. And they were promoting this notion of very low densities. And in the 1999 Planning Act, that density became established as a kind of given maximum density for new housing development. And really, it is that proposition which gave rise to the character of housing in the interwar period in this country, and particularly in London. And it coincided with the time when it's sort of Metroland moment. It's when the suburban railways were being built and more roads were being built. So it suddenly became much easier to get into the centre. So the travelling distance wasn't a problem. So that distance could grow, but densities remained very, very low everywhere. And funnily enough, in Bath, it's interesting, when you look at the Abercrombie plan for Bath, 1945, which obviously was a kind of critical moment for Bath, and in a way laid these sorts of drawings, laying the kind of the ground for the sack of Bath to happen some 20-25 years later. Interestingly, that I hadn't realised, I just found this recently, that included in that is Twerton. Actually, they show an image of the plans proposed for Twerton as an exemplar, if you like, of how housing might be built. And in the end, of course, Twerton isn't really an exemplar. It's actually, in a way, that density is part of the problem, I think, in Twerton. Just having more open space isn't enough. In the end, it is about the relationships of buildings to open space, of roads to open space. It's about movement and overlooking and all sorts of other things which go together to make successful housing. London then, having reached this point where it's growing within the whole of its borders, it has a problem which you're all very familiar with here, which is that it's surrounded by a green belt. So it has no room to expand. It's reached the limits of expansion, and therefore it has to, and that's why the opportunity areas came about, because the only way of growing London was to increase the density, effectively. That became the only option, was to look at parts of London where the density should grow. And so the opportunity areas are then saying, well, if they're going to grow, the places for that to happen are where there's really good public transport. That's the only place we should be doing it. So we will look at all those areas where there's stations, where there's capacity to build around stations, and we should let the population grow in those locations. Now that sense of building buildings closer together is something which, I mean, our practice has always been very interested in, and actually I think is very important at King's Cross. This is one of our little watercolours that we did as part of the planning application for King's Cross. But this is a project we worked on a few years earlier, which, well, you'll all recognise this as St Paul's. It's looking at the north transept of St Paul's, and it was a master plan done by Sir William Whitfield, in which, to everybody's amazement, really, he put the buildings incredibly close together. We're 6 metres away from our neighbours here. One nice thing is that we designed the building on the left. Eric Parry, the architect of the Holborn Museum extension, designed the building on the right there. And yet, of course, Sir William was right. You know, it was an incredibly clever move to create this rather kind of tight atmosphere and feel to these buildings sitting below St Paul's, and then St Paul's rises out of this context. And at King's Cross, we designed certainly in the southern half of the site, we tried to kind of work with that sort of scale, those kind of dimensions. And in the end, you know, I think it's one of the things which has given that part of King's Cross a sort of a human scale. I mean, it's a kind of paradox, isn't it? We're putting things closer together. In planning speak, these are canyons. This is a canyon effect. You know, normally it's dismissed for that. But actually what it's doing is creating atmosphere and a sense of an easy place to be. Actually, I could point another Eric Parry building out. There you go. There's another one. And also it's meant at King's Cross that we try to make sure the things which in other projects have been assumed that they will need a huge amount of space, like a primary school, we've tried to draw them into the heart of the city in this way, where we have a lot of people now living around about it. So these are the children of the primary school. They were playing in a park made out of one of the gas holders, but their actual playground is there, and the school is then sitting underneath one of these residential buildings. And it's a fantastic combination. I mean, the school, it works incredibly well for the school, it works very well for everybody who lives and works around about it. And my particular pleasure from this one is that it's not just one school, there's two schools. There's a primary school and a school for deaf children co-located on the site. And because they're co-located, all the primary school children learn sign language. It's a rather kind of wonderful outcome. Now, in a way, building in the heart of London is one thing, but the pressure, the opportunity areas are saying you've got to look at other areas to build more densely and taller as well. And this is Tottenham Hale, which is to the north of London, on the main railway line to Cambridge. So it was one of those areas where density was required. We're actually sitting on the Lee River here, hence the barge, and we're opening out across another bridge to a natural park, to an open landscape to do with the reservoirs and the river. And along the canal there, you can see, I think these are probably 8-story buildings. So I mean, it's a relatively high scale, but in a sense, you know, I think quite appropriate in terms of its wider context. But as you go into the scheme, you can see there are taller buildings again. So this is a significant jump in scale. And of course, there are lots of people questioning this. You know, it hasn't been an easy decision to make, and there's apprehension about it. And so for architects and urbanists like us, you know, just trying to think about how these buildings can relate to the city, these taller buildings can relate to the city. And, you know, we try very hard to find a way of doing that. It is interesting here that the tall buildings are private, built to rent, and all the social housing is actually in the lower buildings, which I think makes the social and family housing the lower buildings, which certainly makes sense to me. And it's also meant that we've gone back into areas which were developed in the 1960s and tried to think again about how they might evolve and how we might build more homes in these locations. And this is a project for a council. This is for Barnet Council in North London. And you can sort of see the red line of the site, and you can probably begin to work out yourselves really what's happened here. But you're sitting in a kind of, I'd say late 19th, early 20th century part of the city here with a lot of rows of terraces, actually a very strong street grid, east-west. And you can see that street grid actually surviving across, in part, across the scheme. And then at a certain point, in the 60s, they cleared away what were probably seen as slums, cleared them away and opened up the landscape. So they made a big space, and then they placed within it a series of new buildings. There are some buildings here, L shapes. There are sort of taller buildings here and other buildings here, and you can see them dotted around the landscape on the inside. But what and at least is sort of what they look like, and that's sort of what the space looks like. But around the edges of the space, you know, it was chaos really, because all you had was the residual, what was left after the buildings were cleared away. So although there was housing being built there, the place that had been made was very unsatisfactory. I mean, it wasn't a failing completely, and actually for the residents, it meant something. And that was one of the things we actually had to learn as we began to work on it. And this was a project where we did work through probably a year of consultation with the people who were living on the site, working with them to try and explore the best way of adding new housing into the site, which obviously, you know, there's a question mark about that. I mean, you're giving up green space to build housing. Is that the right thing to do? But obviously by making this investment, we were able to make a significant investment into the whole site, which is really what in the end the residents you know, realized and wanted to buy into. And we, to our surprise in a way, the scheme that we ended with was not the scheme we began with. We began thinking that we might try and take the freestanding buildings and kind of conjoin them to make courtyards. We also wondered about just reinstating the streets. Could we put the streets back and make sense of that? But in the end, I don't know what happened then, but the last one was the one which it became clear the residents were most interested in. I mean, could they have their park, but could we just make a much, much better park and a more successful relationship between the buildings? And that's exactly what we pursued. So in this overall plan, you can see that we've actually added 1, 2, 3 new buildings into the park, but where a lot of the effort has gone into actually remaking the edge of the site so that that's now a space which has a very clear perimeter. Everybody's looking into the park, so the community of people is, if you like, the community built around the park. And I mean, a little detail, but I mean, it's the sort of thing which I think in the end does make a difference. In the end, why, you know, it's what architects can do, I think, is that if you look at the plans of the houses that were built, the buildings that were built in the 60s, they're all, well, interesting, they're always aligned north-south. I mean, that was the one convention that everything, you forgot about the plan of the city, you just align things north-south. It's very common. They were aligned north-south, and they really had no spatial relationship. I mean, the positions of their facades had nothing to do with the landscape that surrounded them. Whereas the buildings that we've proposed, you'll see they all have two geometries inside them. They all have the north-south geometry because we want to find relationships with the existing buildings, but they also all have this east-west geometry to do with the original streets, which of course influences a lot of things about the positions of the buildings on the edge of the park. And because of that, we hope, I mean, this project is still on site, so I can't quite, you know, convince you at this stage, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are actually generating open spaces which have a kind of order to them because of the relationships between the buildings. And that little kind of trick in the design of the building is something that does that. And that, I mean, for me, that's a kind of fundamental point, which I think very often gets neglected. You know, buildings, of course, they have to house things inside them, you know, so their plan is generated by how they work internally to a great degree. But also buildings fundamentally are the things which define external space. That's the other job they have. And you know, always architects should be thinking about, am I making the best possible external space as well as the best possible internal space? One of the things that followed on from King's Cross was a kind of, because it began in 2000, it wasn't really inspired by sustainability. I mean, sustainability was there then, you know, we knew about it, we were thinking about it, but it wasn't quite the kind of force that it is now since you know, the climate emergency has become more important. And so when we look back at the master plan and the evolution of King's Cross, it was clear that when we took individual buildings, we really could achieve very high standards of environmental performance. Many of the buildings at King's Cross are BREEAM outstanding. I mean, getting that level very high was quite easy. And this is actually a page, I think, I've taken from Bath, Transition Bath's website, but this is just the claim about, or not the claim, I mean, the statement about the fact that Baines has the highest home efficiency standards in the UK. So, you know, you can push these standards very high, which is what's happening now. But it's actually much harder really to say, well, what do you do when you're designing a master plan or designing a piece of city? What is it that then shapes the way that sort of thinking plays out? And there are lots of things you can think about, you know. So there's no shortage of things to consider when you think about a city and how to make it sustainable. But in a way, not all of those are going to actually help you in the end to decide what it is that you're going to draw. You know, they're not quite getting there. They're more sort of policy things. And so I kind of rely on this argument about sustainability, which is a very simple one, which really that sustainability means making the most of what you have and reducing what you need. And that's a kind of imperative that I think drives the way we have to think. So in a master plan now, we begin by looking hard, as we did at King's Cross, but we look hard at all the buildings that are on the site. You know, we want to see what we can get out of those. And so now we don't just keep beautiful historic buildings, we keep all sorts of rubbish. Actually, we keep, you know, all sorts of buildings that have just been built for whatever reason, but if in a way acknowledging the fact that they can have an extended role. I mean, I say all sorts of rubbish. I mean, that's what they felt like when we first saw them. Of course, they'll be wonderful once they're dealt with. And the other thing which I think is sort of fundamental is the issue I've already raised, really, which is about density and the fundamental need for us to try and build more compactly, particularly when we build housing. And this is a list. I have no idea whether you can read any of that, but I'll pick out a couple of things. So if we could build more compactly, we use less land. We can retain more of the natural landscape. We need fewer roads. We reduce infrastructure costs. We can make the car seem less essential. We can make public transport more accessible. We make public transport more viable. We make nicer village-like places. I mean, in my terms, we do. We make it easier to get the shops, so we make the shops and cafes more viable. We reduce building envelopes, so we reduce construction costs. We increase the sense of community. I mean, these are all the trade-offs, I think. And then a slightly provocative first one, I must admit, which is by providing smaller private rear gardens or yards or none at all. Seems a bit strict, doesn't it? But, you know, in a way, just kind of reviewing assumptions about landscape and how landscape works and how it's shared. Now, that sort of thinking wasn't done, I mean, it was done by me, actually, but it was done about another project somewhere else, trying to think about the arguments for building compactly. But it seems to me it's certainly one of the big issues now in terms of the Bath is having to think about. You know, because it has this requirement to propose land for 28,000 new homes across Baines for a 20-year land supply. So that is a huge responsibility. And thinking about what that means, therefore, becomes a kind of key part of the job of the planners, but also something which clearly, you know, exercises my mind as well in the role that I've got. And I think this whole question really of sustainability and how it impacts on the world for us architects and urbanists, but actually for all of us really, means that certain qualities suddenly become uppermost. You know, things have changed around really in the way we think. I was on a design awards jury recently, and it occurred to me that when I'd been on one sort of 20 years ago, that everybody talked about things not being generous enough and praising the generosity of things. And now on design awards, people are talking about the economy of the structure and the minimum use of material, and the whole sense of what is right, what should we be doing, how should we be designing, it's absolutely a moment of transition, to use the word. So it's something is happening at the moment. So efficiency, incredibly important, and connectivity, I think, also incredibly important. I mean, it's important everywhere, it's important in cities, but also I think it's a particular challenge across North Somerset. How do you achieve that level of connectivity, of movement for people, where the car is so kind of dominant? What are the alternatives to that? How can one deal with that? And it is a kind of curiosity that when you look at housing, and you look at housing design in this country, it is hugely regulated. There are an enormous number of standards which define everything about the housing you design, from floor areas of individual units, and they're very precise. These are quite precise numbers you have to conform with. Room sizes, the sizes of balconies, how many cycles you have to accommodate, the energy performance of the building, the nature of the building fabric, the amount of amenity space you have to provide, overlooking, private space. All these things are firmly regulated and standardized. And of course, that's a really good thing, and yet it's also a kind of slightly difficult thing as well, because as we all know, once you have standards, if you have a minimum standard, that becomes the norm, if you see. So everybody builds now to one standard, which in a way is a shame, but hard to know now how to kind of overcome that. But what is really striking, I think, is that there is no equivalent standard for the provision of public transport to housing. There's nothing which says, oh yeah, we'll build here, and we promise to give you within 15 minutes walk, a bus service every 15 minutes, and it'll go on for 15 hours a day. There's no quid pro quo, as it were, saying this is what we'll give you in order to allow you to live here. And I think somehow that issue of public transport has to be tackled by somebody somewhere. I guess in the end it's government, but in a way, unless public transport is taken much more seriously than it is at the moment. I mean, really, ever since Thatcher and the privatisation of buses, it's always really been on the back foot in this country. And if public transport is going to work, of course, walkability is absolutely key to that. I mean, it's a kind of, one has these other words like efficiency and connectivity, and walkability is a kind of odd word because it's not a kind of quality, it's actually there are also some characteristics that you're looking for to make something walkable. But I mean, I think that the fact that walking becomes the nicest way of moving about is really important. And of course, it is also, it's a virtuous circle. If more people walk down a street, then the cafe which is located there trades better, and then more people want to go there, and so on and so forth. So thinking about walkability is really, I think, fundamental to projects at every scale. I mean, whether we're talking about a village or a town or the biggest city in the end, walkability is still a kind of fundamental aspect of all aspects of urbanism. Is how do we achieve that? How do we make that work? Now, of course, the great campaigner on behalf of walkability was Jane Jacobs, who some of you will know very well, others you won't. But she wrote this extraordinary big book in 1961, and she was a campaigner against the prospect of the demolition of huge areas of New York, tenement housing in New York. And she was the first person who really recognized that in that housing, in that urban structure, there were physical qualities and social qualities which really should be protected and preserved and provided a very sound basis for a city. And of course, she was absolutely spot on. Now that idea about what makes a good city and what makes a walkable city is about the life on the street. I mean, she was pointing out how important overlooking of the street was, the activities on the street, but also the way the buildings frame the space, the street as a room, if you like. But that it doesn't only apply to cities. I very much like this quote from Chiquetta Hawkes, who's, again, some of you might know, but maybe more won't, who was an extraordinary archaeologist, British archaeologist, and wrote this rather wonderful book called The Land, which is a kind of history of Britain, but written from the point of view of its landscape and its and its history, but the relationship between history and landscape, I suppose. And when she was trying to talk about the villages in the Cotswolds, actually is where she came across this phrase. She said she wanted to try and describe that quality she felt about places which were rural in character, and yet they had this urban character because they were continuous walls of building making spaces. And so she talks about rural urbanity. And the other person who I'm also very keen on is a planner called Thomas Sharp, who's sort of forgotten about now, but he was a bit later than Abercrombie. He was younger than Abercrombie, but he was one of the people who did receive commissions after the war to do master plans for major British cities. He did Exeter and Oxford and Salisbury and Chichester and maybe some others. And he was I think a very interesting planner. He wrote a lot. He wrote some very beautiful books about the English village, for example. And you know, you can see what he says. I don't really know what to say, but my belief, the sense of enclosure is important in men's habitation everywhere. And he was also somebody who was vehemently opposed to the Garden City. He fought it all the time because he felt they were just misleading themselves in thinking somehow you could bring the city and the countryside together was a mistake. And in the end, there were qualities in the countryside and qualities in the city, and one wanted to really understand what they were. And he produced these beautiful studies of English villages where he was just, he just plotted them and drew them just to try and understand their spatial configuration and how the centres of these villages were defined. As a deliberate kind of process of beginning to think about how to design housing, and he had one or two very modest commissions to design new villages up in Northumberland, which in the end hardly came to naught. But I mean, interesting plans, and interesting how his interpretation of what would make a successful village in terms of its enclosure is followed through. So I'm getting there. One more point I just wanted to make of my kind of qualities or characteristics, which now seem much more important than we'd realised before, and this is one of diversity. In particular, what I suppose is important to us at King's Cross is the incredible mixture of uses within the site. It probably began, we all thought it would be housing and offices, that was sort of easy. But in the end, with an incredibly imaginative client, there's nearly everything there. There's a swimming pool, there's a gym, there's a library, there's a hotel, there are the local authority offices, there are the schools, there are university buildings. There's all sorts of different types of housing, all sorts of different tenures of housing, so people from different generations living there. And that, now there's no question in our mind on projects that we go forward with, that sense of, the mix of things is really what enriches places and where we can achieve what we can. Of course, you can't always. So, there's also another type of place where you have to think, what is a residential environment? But there's certainly this sense of diversity is a strength. And I must say, one of my favourite bits of Bath is this one, which is Great Portland Street. Where I think it's just brilliant, that you've got this very kind of classy housing on one face, then you've got a barber shop, and then you've got a church, and it's just a seamless building. And another thing, no doubt, in the church, well, exactly, there at the moment. So I think that's a real strength. That's interesting that a city can be all these things at once, and again, a kind of goal that we should be aiming for. And just a reminder, really, that this is completely the opposite of what Abercrombie and his contemporaries were imagining was going to happen in the future. So these are drawings taken from Abercrombie's London plan, which he did a couple of years before Bath. And on the left-hand side is a study of Shoreditch, in which they recorded all the different uses that were on the ground. Looks a bit like our King's Cross plan. And on the right is how they thought it should be replanned, and every usage should be put together into different areas within the city. So they were headed in a completely opposite direction at that point. And that idea about how to organise things came through in documents that were then put out immediately after the war in 46 and 47. This is taken from one of those, where you can see on the left-hand side the survey area. I mean, these are pretend, these aren't real. So a pretend survey area with a kind of chaos of things going on in it. And then the introduction of a new road system in the middle drawing, and then the kind of organisation of the uses around that. So there was a kind of rational move going on there. And the two documents I'm referring to are this one, Design and Layout of Roads in Built-Up Areas, 1946, which was the document where the idea of the ring road was really put into British planning, and became a kind of a given, really, for any city that this is what they should be embarking on. And then the second one was the redevelopment of central areas, which was looking at the hearts of towns and cities and seeing how the kind of chaos which you had up there, which they were witnessing, this kind of density that they were looking at in existing towns, should actually be replaced ideally by buildings like this, which were pulled apart, placed apart from each other, with open space in between, and of course with no sense in which they were playing their part within the city. I mean, they become a kind of completely kind of internalised organisation. Those documents then. They weren't, I mean, they were advisory actually, but they had a huge impact on cities all the way across the country. The one on the left is Reading, the one on the right, I think, is Northampton. And I suppose, and for me, I mean, to try and kind of characterise it, I feel what happened was that what was happening was a kind of aspatial urbanism. In other words, an urbanism in which you weren't concerned with the way in which buildings made external space. You were interested in buildings and maybe landscape, but you weren't interested in the way they made external space. And then in terms of buildings, it was what I would say describes autonomous architecture. In other words, an architecture which was internally driven from its own logic, its own internal logic. It wasn't thinking about any of its external relationships. And for a long time, that, I think, did characterize development in this country, and actually, to some extent, all the way over the world. But I think already that has changed. Of course, in Bath, you were lucky, you escaped most of this, but you do have Pines Way, which to me is the one kind of sort of shock horror moment in Bath. There's a big road gyratory sitting in the middle. So if I could do anything in Bath while I'm here, I'd love to try and find a way of changing the nature of Pines Way. And it's possible. This is Coventry. Coventry, amazingly, was, the redevelopment of Coventry and the demolition of much of the medieval city was planned before the Blitz. It wasn't the consequence of the Blitz, it was planned before the Blitz. And the road network, the ring road, was also planned. And you're looking at the station on the left and then the ring road. And then on the right-hand side is the city centre. And what we've been working on over a few years now is a development which is of the land around the station, but also the replacement of that junction and the creation of a land bridge which connects the station and that development through into a direct route right into the city centre. So some of the buildings, two or three of the buildings are now built, but the landscape is now complete, and that connection between the station and the city has now been completely remade. Now, Bath is clearly the antithesis of aspatial urbanism and autonomous architecture. I mean, it's absolutely exemplar of a place where the buildings create spaces. That is what it's all about, and that's why it's so absolutely extraordinary. And in a way, it's the square and the circus and the street which connects it. I think the crescent is particularly interesting because if it was simply the crescent was simply part of a circle, it would be okay. But what's amazing is that it's part of an ellipse and that it curves back around and completes itself and produces these flat kind of palace facades onto the landscape. So it's an incredible piece of thinking, urban thinking, I think. And although you might say, well, is it in enclosing a space? It's looking onto the landscape. Absolutely, it's enclosing a space. You know, to me, it's really doing that job in an extraordinary way. But of course, Bath, it's not just that little sequence, it's everywhere in Bath. As you all know, this extraordinary succession of amazing spaces which are being built of different scales and different characters. But it is their presence as urban rooms of different kinds which is so strong. Now, having been incredibly nice about it, I'm going to say something nasty about these buildings, actually, which is that, I mean, one thing which is very intriguing is that you've got this extraordinary sequence of buildings, and yet when you look at the backs of these buildings, I'm looking at the back of Queen Square, obviously, I'm looking at the back of the Crescent, and then I'm looking at the back of the Circus. And I mean, to be quite honest, if you propose this now, you wouldn't get through design review, you know, you'd have to change it. And in a way that, you know, so there's also this lesson in Bath, which is that buildings always have to think about both sides of themselves, their fronts and their backs. And that's part of what urbanism is all about, really. It's making sure you're resolving everything together, and there are none of these sort of weaknesses. And I very much like Michael Foster's description of the assembly rooms, tucked away behind the Circus in an unimaginative arrangement by the younger Wood. And of course it is, you know, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I think, yes, it isn't. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't work in the city very well, that building. I look and I wonder, I mean, I think probably he should have turned it around, as it were, so that it all, you know, felt like it was at the end of this street and it hit the back. But anyway, the point is that history it provides us with good and bad lessons. You know, if we look hard at what people have done, it helps us understand what we have to do, and that seems to be an example of that. And that phenomenon of these backs is I think, also a bit of a clue in Bath about how it might evolve. This is a site where I think I'm right in saying that there was an application to build a little house onto one of these garage sites, which was turned down. Now, I think this is probably exactly where little houses should be built, and new fronts should be made. So I'm rather in favour of looking at all these little remnants, as it were, in the city centre and say, well, let's try and make something of these now. Let's encourage people to come forward and see what they can produce, because my view is that will make the city better, not worse. And in a similar way, in fact, probably even more important in a sense, is that clearly in the centre of the city there are a lot of upper parts of buildings which are unoccupied, or sometimes occupied as storage only. And you know, to the extent which these could be put back into use, I mean, ideally as housing, but almost any use, I mean, I think that's fundamental, really, to ensuring the life of the World Heritage Site. I mean, in a way, you have to get the buildings into productive use if you're going to get the fabric maintained, as it seemed to me. So I think that in a way is a kind of policy, and it's difficult. You know, I mean, it doesn't happen because people haven't thought of it. Lots of people have thought about it. Lots of people are trying to do it. But I just thought I'd show you, just point this out. And it is complicated because here on this building, for example, you have the existing door. So you might not have the staircase behind that door, but you have the door. And again here into the residential unit above. But this one, you can see the shopfront has lost the door completely. So that can only now be accessed from the building on either side. So there are endless complications involved in this, but I still think it's a really important aspect of things. So, and just to point out that at a point where you're trying to find 28,000 new homes in Bath and North East Somerset, and you're having to look hard at the green belt and the grey belt and seeing what you can do, it's worth remembering that if you can recover one of these homes in the city centre, you might save 300 square metres of green belt. So the gains are enormous every time you do it. And so lastly, really just what am I doing? And just a word, sorry, I've gone on, I'm going to almost reach my hour, but so just a brief explanation. So the idea of the architectural residence was really developed by the Lib Dems, and particularly I think by the leader. It was put in their manifesto last time you elected them. I've always told people that, and about the third time I told people that it was put in their manifesto, somebody said to me, why did they think that would get them re-elected? It's a very good question, I think. Anyway, they did. And So I was then appointed. I'm a professor at the university, but 90% of my time is with the city, a 2-day-a-week professor. And the Medlock Trust generously funded my role. Initially 18 months, you know, it may be sensible in the end to try and extend it a little bit. And really I have no responsibilities, I have no department, I have nobody works for me. So really what I'm doing is talking to people. I'm getting involved in as many aspects of Bath and North East Somerset as I possibly can. Thinking about the issues which everybody, you know, the regeneration team or the planning policy team are dealing with. I'm very interested in getting very hands-on involved in design review of projects that are coming forward into the system, and helping to get those to be as good as they can be. I'm not going to read through those. I'm going to assume you might have done that in the time I've been wittering on. And then I do also draw. So that's what I used to do as an architect in practice, and I still find that drawing as a way of thinking about what people are proposing is a way of communicating. You know, for me, actually, it's a way of me understanding what they're doing, so I can help, and then a way of kind of communicating how things might improve. Right. I'll stop there, but I would, you know, be very happy to respond to questions.
Hello. So we'd now, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. We'd now like to invite questions from the floor. We've got a roving mic, and please, when you wait for the mic to arrive, and make your questions brief, if possible. So, this lady here on the end.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Liz. I was intrigued at your comment that we didn't know anything about sustainability before 2000.
Well,
And this leads on to a second question. How much have you paid attention to European policy and good practice on sustainable cities, which has been going since the mid-90s? So in particular, there was a green paper on the urban environment that the European Commission produced in 1990, which was all about compact cities and basically making European cities more like Florence.
all right, no, you're
But
right.
it influenced Richard Rogers and
yes,
the Urban
absolutely.
Task Force, and there are
Yeah,
many
right.
other things which you haven't mentioned at all. So.
A glib statement, and I probably shouldn't have just said it quite like that. And of course, we were aware of these things going on, and clearly, you know, Rogers was very involved at that moment. And the work that we were doing was absolutely embedded in a way of thinking, you know, generally about cities. But people weren't producing, you weren't just, I mean, it was a way of working, if you like. I don't think when people asked us to say, you know, how does sustainability inform exactly the way you were laying out the site, I think that wasn't in the forefront of our minds. I mean, maybe I'm owning up to that, you know, but clearly we were probably the first to achieve the sort of those characteristics in a London, you know, in a big London project. I would have thought. I mean, you told me you're wrong. Certainly Richard Rogers isn't. All I'm really saying is that it's changed. You know, I mean, I wouldn't talk about it. I couldn't have talked about it then the way I can talk about it now. That's really what I'm saying. That it was a different world, and you know, we were thinking about it, and I don't know. Things change so quickly. I mean, you're making assumptions about things you might have done then, which would be completely different now. So you're right, of course. You know, it's been a longer story. I mean, to be honest, in my first year at architecture school in 1971, it was on the agenda then. There's no doubt about it. People were talking about it. I mean, it wasn't in the centre of public attention then, but it was already there. It was already being talked about. So it has been 50 years of evolution. All I was really trying to say is that the climate movement, the sense of urgency, I think, is tipped, and therefore the responses that people make
Okay, thanks. And just to say, there are many other European cities with very good examples.
Absolutely.
And I'm hoping that and when you're looking for good practice, for example, at identifying best practice in recent housing projects, please look outside the UK to places like Copenhagen,
Well,
like this,
I mean, of course,
see how they're
of
doing.
course we do, you know, and Copenhagen is a model. I mean, well, I'll tell you a little story. Actually, the Malmö scheme in Malmö, the one by the waterfront, by Klaus Town, for example. The lovely story is that Klaus Town used to, when he was a young architect, he worked for Ralph Erskine, the Anglo-Swedish architect, and he came and worked on projects in this country. And I know, and Klaus Town, they told me, when he was here, he had Thomas Sharp's books, and every weekend he'd go off and look at English villages. So actually, you know, English villages partly was to inform that kind of quality that he achieved in Malmö. So yeah, of course, yeah, one has to look everywhere, and of course, in many ways, they're the leaders. You know, we're the followers. I couldn't agree more. So I'm not in any way, you know, claiming things that for us that other people haven't done in all sorts of other places. Anyway.
Okay, who else would like to ask a question? The gentleman there in the navy shirt.
Brilliant first hour, so thank you very much for what you've explained there. I do work for the council. I'm Richard, but on business engagement. I'm interested to know, for those that don't know, forgive me, most people will, but the REC, of course, home of Bath Rugby. Now, I saw some designs earlier this year, I think, an architectural impression of an amphitheatre in limestone, which I thought looked fantastic. But I wonder, what are your thoughts about what to do with the REC?
Well, by a happy coincidence, one of the things that was sort of agreed is that I shouldn't get involved in schemes that are already in the planning process, which I think is probably, you know, sensible, if a little bit frustrating. So, I mean, I haven't, and I certainly won't. I won't be used as a, you know, I won't comment on a planning application, if you see what I mean. So my views won't come out in that way ever. I mean, I've seen that image, you know, which is a kind of hypothetical project, wasn't it? A kind of, which was, you know, intriguing in all sorts of ways. I've seen some more recent images of later versions of the scheme, which I think look like an interesting new evolution in the design. But it is it's a very complex situation, isn't it? I mean, for me, it's fantastic having the rugby ground there. I think it's an amazing phenomenon, you know, that in the centre of the World Heritage Site, you've got a rugby ground. I mean, I love the fact that you can see the stands, you know, from outside, and that's the thing I'm worried about losing that in the new scheme, really. But that's about as far as I probably ought to go.
Any other questions? This lady there in the white.
I'm French, so sorry, my English is not so good. I understood that you were not very happy with the garden long time ago, the politics of garden in London. But what about today's landscaping, which is very important for the cities and mainly to struggle against climate change?
Yes, exactly.
So my question is very precise. In Bath, we have a lot of graded buildings. But in these graded buildings, we are not allowed to have a gazeled window, neither solar panels.
Yeah.
And to answer to the lady, I am from Paris. In Paris, in the graded buildings, we are not allowed to have shutters. That's even worse, you know. And of course, we are not allowed to have solar panels. So do you think one day, because with the climate change, we cannot stay like that. It will be possible first to change the law and allow solar panel, double glazing and so on. And second, negotiate with UNESCO. So UNESCO did not decide to withdraw Bath because Bath has solar panels and double glazing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's such an interesting point you've made, and one which I'm very aware of here, that these sorts of challenges. I mean, I'm not the right person in the end to make these decisions, but I mean, all I can really say is that in fact, funny enough, tomorrow, I've actually got a meeting tomorrow for the first time with the World Heritage Site Advisory Board, I think it is, where I wanted to talk through exactly all of these issues, just in order to know that I understood the current situation. I mean, I do feel that over time, these things will have to evolve and change. I mean, probably, well, I don't, you know, it's hard to sort of, I mean, I suppose I feel that the planting of trees in the city, for example, is something that at some point one will have to kind of think harder about, on whether that should be considered. You know, but equally, of course, I'm fully aware of the argument against it, you know, and I'm sympathetic to that. So, you know, I think it's, I mean, I do know that there's the planning office is trying to develop a process whereby putting photovoltaics panels into the inner roofs on properties will be something which is completely allowed. So there's definitely movement there to try and do things. And I mean, all I can really say is to sort of agree with you that these are important issues, which all I think is they just have to be debated. You know, you can't sort of take a decision and forget about them. They are things that are going to keep recurring because the issues are going to get more important every year.
Other questions? The lady at the back with the white, black top, you, long hair.
Hello, yeah, hello, good evening, Bob. Just to say, to answer the question about panels and double glazing,
Yeah.
there is a lot of flexibility around these things from Historic England and also from the council. So there's many things you can actually do to make your home more sustainable while protecting the listed building. So that is there. That is there. But, you know, the World Heritage Site does give us a reason to really excel, but it also puts in place a lot of factors that we need to consider. What's valuable about the site and how does that interact with developments that you're proposing? And I wondered if you had any thoughts from all your conversations about how the World Heritage Site and its values may actually assist in the process of designing more sustainable cities.
That's interesting. It's funny. I suppose I've tended to think about it. You always think about it the other way around. I realize I always think about where is it making life harder, as it were, rather than, you know, where it might be assisting us. I mean, I suppose it would be nice to feel that one could make improvements into the fabric. I mean, not just the buildings, but the ground plane of the city centre. You could make improvements there which were going to improve the way the city worked in terms of particularly maybe of movement around the city, which would enhance its sustainability. I can see that. In a sense, there's a kind of natural coincidence now in some ways about attitudes towards building scale and the limitations that come out of the World Heritage Site. So I think those two things are probably working together in a way that maybe in previous times they seemed to be more in conflict. I mean, I don't... And then there are areas where I suppose I feel sometimes that the constraints imposed by the World Heritage Site are inhibiting things sometimes, and things might have been better, as it were, if they were less inhibited. I mean, I'm very interested by the one about the views in and out and the setting and all that, because to me, it's obviously, it's so important, you know what I mean? It's such an important thing. And yet, I think sometimes it's led to projects being shaped. They've lost other qualities of the ability to make successful spaces because they're the byproduct of the views, if you see what I mean. So I suppose with all these things, I just feel that they just have to be in the conversation, that design, the design process is always one of working with those sorts of constraints, isn't it? It's another one to draw in and hopefully make the most of. Not a very good answer, sorry.
No, it's a big challenge, but thank you for having a go, and it's great that we're in dialogue about how we can work together. Thanks. This lady here, do you want?
Thank you for an interesting talk. You mentioned on the board there comments on public realm, comments on local plan. Have you, since you've been here, are you giving your interest and your ideas to A, the planning committee, or B, the developers? Are you finding now that you are being used?
So I get involved in various different ways. So I can respond. Sometimes a planning officer will contact me and say they've received material for a pre-app and they would like to talk to me about it, and we discuss it. I'm very happy to talk directly to a developer on a project and feed in directly, or they can feed it back. Sometimes I've been involved in a conversation where a developer's approached a councillor and they would like to have me in the conversation, so I'll be there then. Sometimes an architect has contacted me and said, I'm struggling with something. Could you help me? So really, I'm incredibly. I go where people invite me. If you really, for me, it's one of the most interesting aspects of the work, really. So I would like, if anything, for that to happen more. And I think it's something where we're all, because it's a kind of newly invented role, we're all kind of gradually learning, what it is and how it can work best. But I mean, yes, I'm trying to feed in directly to projects.
You're being listened to.
Well, that time will tell really on that. I mean, I've always been received, generously. I haven't had any kind of situation where people haven't been interested in what I'm saying. And in a way, I am able to, I am bringing something a little bit different than they are going to get in feedback from a planning officer, so it is a sort of slightly different interface. And in a way, one interesting thing is that planning is a very formal process, really. As you know, where a pre-app is you have to pay for it. You pay for it. You submit your drawings. The drawings are distributed between all the relevant officers. They all write their reports, and you have the meeting, and then the reports are sent back. So there's a lot of documentation, a lot of fixes that are generated. Whereas my sort of advice is much more informal, and you can ignore it. So in a sense, people can exploit it if they want to. And so it is a different kind of conversation, and it's something which probably used to happen much more in the planning process, 20 or 30 years ago. Now it's much harder for planners to operate, quite in that way. So it's an interesting adjunct into the process, I think.
The lady there in the orange top.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. I'm wondering whether any work is being done on evaluating the 4 relatively recent housing developments in Bath. I'm thinking of the 3 on the former MOD site and also the Riverside, just to look at how successful or otherwise they've been in providing for example, homes for local people at affordable prices rather than homes for people wanting to move into the delightful city of Bath.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Well,
think that's one of the big challenges.
okay. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question that you ended up with, you see what I mean, which is whether they've provided the right affordable housing or enough, or whether it's affordable or not, all those things. So I really don't know that, whether that's happened or not. I certainly have been to see them all, and I've been to see them with other planning officers, with a landscape architect, you know, with different people, because in a way it seemed to me very good to have a common, they became a kind of common ground of experience which we would all have. So I wanted to do that. And I've been to see housing schemes across North Somerset as well. I have started to do a kind of, I know it's a document or a PowerPoint, where I've tried to record both my comments and other comments that I've heard people make about things which are successful or which fail, in order that those lessons can be fed into this next big wave of housing. And some of those are very kind of macro scale things, you know, about the way the housing is placed within the city or something, or but equally, you know, tiny details about how the edges of roads are designed and so on. I mean, I think that's, so I do think I think learning from what's being built is really important actually, and feeding it in, and there's a lot of stuff has been built, so there's a lot to go and look at. I don't know whether socially they've been successful. I mean, you know, I certainly feel with Mulberry Park, I certainly feel that that's quite an achievement, I must say. You know, it's not all fantastic by any means, but I do think that's a considerable achievement to have made that happen. Obviously, Curo particularly involved there. And I think the community centre and the school location and the way that's been planned is absolutely brilliant. You know, is a kind of, you know, top class, as it were. You know, in terms of thinking about how those sorts of uses should be integrated into new schemes. So I might try and find out a bit more about that question, really, about the mixes and how that has evolved over time. But certainly looking at them and comparing them and thinking about them is something that I am trying to take on myself.
There's a gentleman here in the black top.
Thank you, Bob, very much. How timely that you're meeting with the World Heritage Site Board tomorrow. Yeah. And my question is, what will you be representing and stance will you take with regard to the outstanding universal values of this World Heritage Site? Well,
I don't think there's any choice of protecting those. So, you know, that's to me is a given. All I'm saying is that the world changes, and so the logic you apply, you know, you might end up saying exactly the same thing in 10 years' time, or 20 years' time, or 50 years' time. You know, you might say exactly the same universal values. Buildings have to be, you know, you have to treat everything exactly the same way. But I think you just have to keep having the conversation. I don't think you can say it's just going to go away. You know, the changes are so radical that we're in at the moment in terms of the way we have to think about our environment. I think it's appropriate that we all reflect on them. So I'm not proposing sacrificing anything. I'm just saying that it would have seemed weird to me, to be honest, if I hadn't at some time during my period here, if I hadn't had a conversation about them, about these issues with them, really. So that's sort of where my position is.
Yes, thank you, Bob. I found that very enlightening. You will know that there are probably more architects in Bath than there are in Southwark and Spitalfields combined. And they all have their point of view. Yeah. They all have their relations with the council. And of course, in this democracy we live in, councillors are elected, and they rely on the officers for direction. Yeah. And it's very important that you appreciate that it's not the councillors that are important, actually, it's the officers, and his analysis of the report is very, very important. That's the level you have to get down to. I would just like to comment on the recreation ground a moment. You must appreciate that the council has a contract with the citizens of Bath, going back to 1956, that will remain open space in perpetuity. Yeah. Now that is a contract. It's a public contract. It's signed under seal, and it stands. Yeah. So what we're looking at, these pretty little drawings, are a diversion from that principal factor. You in your travels and working in North London, King's Cross and Doha, Toronto, I see where you've been. You have a particular ability to identify the particularity of Bath. This little village that we live in here has a particular character. That's what has to be identified.
I'm not sure whether that was a question in the end, but I am glad I'm not a lawyer. Anyway, let's put it that way.
Okay, we've got one more. One more
sorry.
question. Yes,
Can you do, yeah, sorry.
you carry on. Oh.
Sorry. So I really appreciated the discussion on sustainability with more urban density, public transportation, reducing commuting time. Is there discussion about making housing more resilient for hotter summers and not just reliant on AC? So looking at old European technology or turn of the century American apartments with ceiling fans, shutters on the outside, in relation to those minimum standards of making them not just reliant on air conditioning, but resilient structurally.
Well, I mean, definitely. I mean, we don't want to be putting air conditioning into houses. So, we're all having to think about the orientation. I mean, it changes the way we plan buildings now, so the sort of plan types that we produce are different. I mean, it's, relatively easier to kind of smaller scale homes. I mean, the changes in the fabric of our buildings are unbelievable now. I mean, I look at drawings. I mean, the walls of our houses the thickness has doubled in my lifetime, in my career as an architect. They've gone from we used to design 270, and now we're up to sort of 575 or something. So that's been an incredible shift in quite a short period of time in terms of the way that we make our buildings. So the fabric of the buildings is changing, has changed radically. I mean, the standards are very high now. Obviously there's a sort of two things going on here. In a sense, there's one about not having to heat your buildings anymore. So on the one hand, you're trying to develop fabric which does that. And then obviously you have the kind of, which sometimes is almost the opposite problem, having to keep them cool. So I think that's a fundamental aspect of architecture. I mean, I'm nervous about, there's one thing that unnerves me slightly, just to get off my chest, is that for about 10 years, we designed all our housing. I mean, having said they were wrong to do this in the 60s, we designed housing, everybody started designing housing on a north-south axis, because everybody thought it was much better to face east and west than to face south. So housing tended to all be designed like that. And that lasted for about 15 years. And then everybody realized actually it was much easier to shade a south-facing elevation because you could effectively shade it. So it'd be much better if everything was aligned north-south. So most kind of passive house projects are now aligned the other way. Typical, actually, of the way my point about about sustainability and its history and how it evolves. That these things are changing all the time. I mean, architects are very, architects and young architects are really driven now by the ability to make these buildings work well environmentally. So it's gone right up the agenda. So those sorts of issues I think will fall into play on all projects, going forward, inevitably.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob, for your contribution this evening. It's been fascinating.
Pleasure.
I think we're going to have to wind up now.
Thank you.